Thank you very much for inviting me here. I of course don't read Sinhala, I don't speak Sinhala, but I thought this is a very important thing that this group has done to translate Ajahn Chang's work. Not because I agree with Ajahn Chang, scholars, especially on the left, we disagree with each other over the number of angels on a pinhead. So whenever there's something to disagree, we disagree. But it's very important to keep that flame burning in Sri Lanka of critical thinking. And that's why I think this is such an important enterprise. Usually what I like to do is tell everyone my roadmap for what I want to say. So this is my roadmap. I'm going to say three things. The last thing may be a bit disturbing, but I can't help myself. The first thing that I want to say is, well, the talk is about the IMF and their diagnoses and policy recommendations. It's very important to know the IMF is a creature of the Western countries. So that's the starting point. The second thing to note is there is no logical, theoretical, or empirical support for anything the IMF says. But we have hidden it. We have hidden it. And I'm just going to mention a couple in passing. Okay, so this is the general point. The third thing I want to say is the clearest illustration of this is the IMF's diagnosis of Sri Lanka and its policy recommendations. This has no theoretical basis, and there is no empirical evidence to support them. Hence, they refuse constantly to engage us in any discussion. Wherever at least I or my son are to be found, you will never see IMF people. They will not answer any of these questions. In fact, some of our friends have tried at least half a dozen times to get them into the same room to have a discussion. They will not do it because they know that their arguments are weak. They know it, and I know that they know it. And I know precisely which these arguments are, and I will tell you in brief which these arguments are. So that's my second point. My third point is not a very pleasant thing to say. In 1995, I was working with a company called eConsult, together with Professor Luxman. Shows our age, doesn't it? And we had a lot of business supporters, people who followed us because we told the truth. We didn't care whether it was politically pleasant or not, but we just told the truth. And then, as soon as the then president, Chandrika Kumar started working with the IMF, I told all the business people that followed us, disinvest from Sri Lanka. Because no country has ever done well once the IMF has come in. A lot of them disinvested from Sri Lanka, and the president was not very happy with me. But I actually don't care. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference to me whether politicians like me or don't like me. What I will say is in 2008, Dr. Harsha De Silva, we know him, don't we? Dr. Harsha De Silva, he interviewed me in January of 2008 when he was a journalist. And I told him, Harsha, take cover, because there's a gigantic crisis coming our way and Sri Lanka will not escape. Now, Harsha repeated that presentation, which was 1 hour long, at least 4 times. Because as it transpired, that's what happened. In 2020, I gave 3 lectures here in Sri Lanka, and I told people, I'm sorry to say that there's likely to be a crisis, a foreign exchange crisis. 2020, I have it on record. Now I'm going to tell you that by 2028 there will be another foreign exchange crisis. Except this time it will be worsened by a domestic credit crisis. Okay, so it's not very pleasant. I'm so sorry if it ruins your evening. But I always have to say what I believe. I do hope this time I'm wrong. I think I said that in 2020, wasn't it, Lakshman? I said, I hope this time I'm wrong. But I don't think so. Just to add one thing, which is a theme running through what I say, is the question often asked is, why is there a lot of support for the IMF in so many developing countries? Actually, there's not a lot of support for the IMF. It's the support from local and foreign elites. And they use their power and influence to basically intimidate governments into bringing the IMF in. Why do they do that? Because in every single case, and there is virtually no instance where there is an exception to this, it is the foreign and local elites that win when the IMF comes in, and the burden of adjustment is entirely on the poor people. And they know this, that's why they ask for the IMF to come in. And as soon as the IMF comes in, they know they're going to be better off. And they certainly won't be bearing the cost of the adjustment. So this is not just Sri Lanka, this is everywhere in the world. Okay, I'm going to split what I have to say in 2 parts. One is a general part, and the other is the Sri Lanka case study. So I'll spend a bit more time on the Sri Lankan case study, but it's important to know who the IMF is, why was it set up, and what does it do? So IMF was one of 3 major institutions set up after the Second World War. The 3 institutions are IMF, World Bank, and what is today called the World Trade Organization, but it began its life as something called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, okay, the GATT. And the role of these 3 organizations was to secure the dominance of the US and its allies over the global economy. That was their role, and that was quite explicit. I start with an interesting fact. In its early days, the IMF was asked, together with the World Bank and the GATT, to support the reconstruction of Europe and Japan in its early days. And as a consequence, the IMF came with a thinking that when countries ran balance of payments deficits, in other words, more money was going out than coming in, whenever a country ran a deficit, it wasn't their fault alone. It was also the fault of the surplus countries. And this means that to solve their problems wasn't only their responsibility, but was also the responsibility of the surplus countries. So the deficit countries had to reduce their expenditure, but the surplus countries had to increase their expenditure and help the deficit countries to generate a surplus. So that was the beginning of IMF's thinking because the aim was to help Europe and Japan to reconstruct. Now, by about early 1970s, Europe had been reconstructed, and so had Japan. Now the IMF's thinking started to change. Because what the Western countries wanted was the IMF to discipline developing countries. So now they suddenly changed and said, if you have a balance of payments deficit, it's your fault alone. Now, don't forget, we're now in the middle of a war between, an economic war between US and China. And who does US blame for its trade deficit? It blames China. You notice, the surplus country. But from 1970s onwards, a new philosophy was adopted by the IMF that the fault of the deficit country was the government of the deficit country. Spending too much and printing money to finance the deficit. Okay, so it's very familiar to everyone, I believe. So apart from the main recommendation to developing countries to cut the budget deficit and stop printing, the IMF also said, well, part of the problem is you're not liberalized enough. Your markets are not open enough. Now here, you have to realize that from 1946 right through to 1970, the mantra was Europe should not open up its markets while it's industrializing. Okay, so there was no requirement for Europe to liberalize. There was no requirement for Europe to open up its markets. But fast forward to 1970s, and IMF comes, well, you not only have to cut your budget deficit, remember, Europe did not have to cut its budget deficits, but you have to now liberalize. Remember, Europe did not have to liberalize. In fact, the explicit argument was Europe should not liberalize. And that's why the GATT didn't do anything for nearly 20 years. Because the justification was Europe was developing. You don't hear that justification today for any developing country. We now move to the Sri Lankan debt crisis. So debt crisis breaks out in 2022. Of course, it was building before that. But what was the IMF's diagnosis and what was its policy recommendations? Well, now it should be obvious. The diagnosis was it was fault of the Sri Lankan government. Okay, nothing to do with any external factors. It was the fault of the Sri Lankan government. And the policy recommendations were that the deficit must be cut and there could be no printing of money to finance the deficit. No printing by the central bank, either directly or indirectly. This is where the new Central Bank Act comes in. By the central bank, and it's the first central bank in the world that actually is prevented from buying any government debt, whether directly or indirectly. It's the first central bank. So this was the main policy recommendation of the IMF. Now I have 3 points to make about these diagnosis and policy recommendation. The first point is that it's based on a theory that is now totally discredited. It's based on a theory called the quantity theory of money. That theory was printing money causes inflation. Okay, you must have heard it. If I take a trishaw anywhere in Sri Lanka and I ask, why was Sri Lanka having this high inflation, the trishaw driver would say, because the government printed money. You know, it's the Rajapaksas. They printed all this money and spent all of it, and that's why we got inflation. So actually, you don't need a PhD. You can be a trishaw driver and come up with the same conclusion. The problem is this is wrong. The advanced country central banks started to realize it was wrong. They started to realize actually it's not central banks that print money, it's commercial banks. Whenever the commercial bank goes to the central bank and asks the central bank for cash, the central bank has to give it the cash. It has no choice. So they started to argue, and you can see it in all the advanced country central bank reports, they started to point out that this quantity theory had no theoretical or empirical validity. And it started with the Bank of England. They were one of the first to come up with lots of articles pointing this out. And in recent times, it ends with the head of the US Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, giving testimony in the US Congress, where he says, quite categorically, apart from all the theory, we've now had 12 years of non-stop immense printing of money in the advanced countries, printing like no one has ever seen. Where's the inflation, he says? In fact, inflation actually fell over the 12 years, in spite of the greatest printing that was ever seen. And he concludes and tells the US Senate, he says, when I was young, I believed in this theory, but I guess now I have to relearn my economics. And I think that's a really, really stark thing for someone in his position to say. Now I turn to Sri Lanka, just a couple of points there. I don't want to labor it too much. But my son produced a table drum. And in that table, he shows that from the time of J.R. Jayawardeneput to the Gota Rajapaksa government, printing to finance the budget deficit fell by 80%. 80% fall. But the trade imbalance remained more or less exactly where it was in the J.R. Jayawardeneput period. So, in other words, the trade balance has always been, imbalance, deficit, has always been between -10 and -12%. And it didn't matter that the central bank basically collapsed its printing to fund the budget deficit. And I believe Bram raised this point with Shanta Devaraj, one of the advisors to Ranil Wickremesinghe. And Shanta did what a lot of the academics do today. He completely ignored this statistic because he has no answer. Of course he has no answer. He doesn't know what to say. This is Professor Shanta Devaraj, 40 years experience in the World Bank, advisor to Ranil Wickremesinghe, and he doesn't know what to say to a very simple statistic like that. The second empirical point comes from the central bank itself. Now, I say the central bank itself because the current governor has been one of those who keeps repeating non-stop. The central bank, in its 2024 report, showed us in 7 pages a remarkable thing. They said that the inflation in that period had nothing to do with monetary policy or fiscal policy. It was fundamentally due to external factors. They say supply-side factors. In other words, the surge in global energy prices and the supply chain problems. This is the Central Bank of Sri Lanka admitting that actually its own governor got it wrong. And worse still is not only did the governor get it wrong, but the policies implemented made that damage done to the economy even worse. Apart from getting it wrong, apart from the wrong diagnosis, the IMF deliberately ignores 2 points. The first point is that Sri Lanka's debt crisis owes a considerable amount to the Ranil Wickremesinghe government from 2015 to 19. During that government, the central bank borrowed $14.5 billion of international sovereign bonds. 14.5 billion in one of the shortest periods of time. In the final year of that government, the governor borrows $4.5 billion. Now, yesterday in a presentation he makes at the central bank, he gives this justification, which honestly leads me to question his sanity. But the thing he says is we had to borrow internationally because the interest rates on the loans we got was cheaper than if we had borrowed locally. Now, you're borrowing in foreign currency. As soon as there's a depreciation, the local value of that foreign debt is going to rise. And just remember, the currency depreciated by 80%. That means, in local currency terms, what they borrowed rose by 80%. And here he's telling us that because at the time he borrowed it was cheaper, that was the justification. I mean, this I find outrageous. And I find outrageous that nobody commented on it immediately. But the second thing he says is I had to borrow 4.5 billion in my last year because I realized Sri Lanka could not borrow after we left office. So this is going to open the floodgates. From now on, any central banker can go around borrowing 10, 20, 30 billion, saying, look, after I leave office, I'm pretty sure no one else is going to lend to Sri Lanka. So in other words, you saddle the country with a massive ISP debt on the assumption that they won't be able to borrow in the future. Now, here's the important thing. In the period 2015 to 19, Sri Lanka was involved with another EFF, Extended Fund Facility arrangement with the IMF. In other words, the IMF knew perfectly well what Sri Lanka was doing. And they never once said, this is unsustainable foreign debt. They never once said that. Whereas to everybody else, it was patently obvious, COVID or no COVID, there was not a chance in hell of Sri Lanka being able to service that debt. Basically, they tied a noose around Sri Lanka's neck. And it is still that noose that is there. And this is one of the big problems. But the IMF says nothing about it. Nothing about it. In fact, when they focus on the budget deficit, it's what's called the primary deficit, excluding interest payments. Excluding interest payments. In other words, it's okay. You have to pay all this interest. And let's forget about that for the moment. The second thing that the IMF ignores, and this I understand better because the role of the IMF is very clear, and that is to block industrialization of developing countries. I think this is very clear and was one of their mandates from the beginning. Everything the IMF does is there to block industrialization. Why? Well, firstly, because industrialization is the only way that developing countries have ever developed. It's the only way. There are no exceptions to that. And I think it was 3 years ago, Bram, that you came up with this chart, a remarkable chart of 182 countries, isn't it? 182 countries, and he splits them into two groups, industrializing and non-industrializing. Non-industrializing was about 121 of that. And all industrializing countries, over a 40-year period, had trade and current account surpluses. All non-industrializing countries had deficits. So, when the IMF blocks countries going down the industrialization path, it's condemning them to continuous deficits. And when you have deficits, you have to borrow to bridge the gap. And when you borrow to bridge the gap, eventually you have a debt problem. And when you have a debt problem, who do you go to? Yes, back to the IMF. And this is the game that is played. So Sri Lanka has been to the IMF 17 times. This is one of the saddest things I ever hear, is the argument that it's our fault. 17 times it's our fault. Zambia 21 times it's our fault. Are you insane? You know, it's the rape victim saying, I was responsible for the rape. You know, this is the sort of approach that is being adopted. So, what are the consequences? And I have two that I've identified. One is a high and unsustainable level of debt. And the reason is very simple. Both domestic and foreign debt have been commercialized. So interest rates now are much, much higher than in the past, especially if you look at real interest rates. If you look at government spending on servicing debt in Sri Lanka, it's about the highest in the world. It used to be the case that Sri Lanka's welfare expenditure as a percentage of total fiscal expenditure was quite high. Now it's dwarfed. It's not even a quarter of debt servicing expenditure. This is absurd. This is not sustainable. This is not going to be sustainable going forward. The second thing is, and I think I can summarize it best in an article that appeared in the Morning newspaper 2 days ago. And in the article, it pointed out that energy consumption by factories had fallen by 20% since 2022. And this corroborates a chart that, again, my son keeps producing all these charts which drive me mad. I lose sleep whenever I see one of these charts. But a chart where actually industrial production has not been able to come back to its 2019 level. And what we are now seeing is actually a further deindustrialization of the economy. Now the question is, with all this foreign debt servicing, how is it going to be paid for? Tourism? Private remittances? I don't think so. I don't think so. Any random event that damages our tourism, we are in trouble. We're in serious trouble. And we've already seen those random events in the past. So I get worried when I see this weakening of manufacturing production. So I have two conclusions. First one is what I started with, is I see it very difficult for Sri Lanka to avoid a foreign debt crisis once it begins to service the foreign debt. And most importantly in this context is I see it almost impossible for Sri Lanka to avoid also a domestic debt crisis along with that foreign debt crisis. And the reason is the Central Bank Act. The Central Bank Act prevents the central bank buying a lot of government debt as a safety valve. Okay, because the act is there, although there's certain ambiguities allowing for some purchase of the debt, it's not anything like a sustainable level. And the second conclusion I have is, how can Sri Lanka avoid the crisis? I think it can't avoid it, but it can postpone it. And it can postpone it by doing two things. The first of these is to deflate the economy, to reduce the level of economic activity, and to some extent that's happening now. The second thing it may be forced to do is to dig the hole deeper. In other words, borrow more commercially, internationally. Digging the hole deeper. Postponing the inevitable collapse. I don't, at this moment in time, see anything else on the horizon, but that's perhaps because I'm not privy to the plans of the current government. Thank you.